David.
Adam, how you doing? Welcome to West Virginia.
Thank you for having me in West Virginia. I think it was my second time in West Virginia. First time I was here to see Shane, and then I went on Timcast.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Which, by the way, Shane speaks very highly of you.
Oh, well, Shane's great. We were at his place for Christmas. Beautiful family. He's a dynamite writer.
Yeah.
Really just very creative, and yeah, he's a great writer.
Yeah.
Very good dude.
And he has a great sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
That was like, I'm one of those people, I'm really into like comedies and stuff like that. And people who don't take themselves too seriously, you know, they typically have like a really good sense of humor, and they make you want to be around them. So that's one thing that sticks out to me when it comes to Shane.
I think that's right. I think it's important. I think it's important in a columnist. I mean, I think there aren't a lot of very good columnists who aren't at least capable of being funny, right? I mean, like George Will is a great columnist, and he's not typically ha-ha funny, but sometimes he is, you know, right. He's more of a sort of like cerebral funny, but I think it's definitely part of the game, you know? Yeah. You have to have some of that.
I agree. I think the humor part is something that once in a while I'll add in, and that's kind of like my personality, because I typically have like a straight face.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I have like a really good joke.
Yeah.
And it catches people off guard. So that's kind of like where they don't expect it, so it's even better.
Yeah.
But.
Oh, okay, yeah. So garlic bread. These two starters are from my two favorite Italian restaurants in Philly, both in South Philly, obviously. So the garlic bread's in the style of Villa di Roma, which was owned by a guy named Cuz, who also owned a place called Cuz's Little Italy. And that was where Angelo Bruno, it was outside of there that Angelo Bruno, who had been the boss of the Philly mob for about 2 decades, got whacked in 1980, right outside Cuz's place. And then the prosciutto and melon is a staple starter at Dante and Luigi's, which is down the street. And Dante and Luigi's, so Angelo Bruno had gotten whacked by Nicky Scarfo so that he could become the boss. And in 1989, they tried to whack little Nicky's son at Dante and Luigi's, and they shot him, but they didn't kill him. But that's sort of the pedigree of the food and the restaurants.
Food and death.
They tend to involve, you know. I mean, it's no different in Little Italy. They were sort of the clubhouses, or they weren't the clubhouses, but they were definitely an important part of the scene.
See, I know that it was in the 80s, the whole mob thing kind of died off. At least like in New York City. So it was kind of following the same path in Philadelphia?
Well, I mean, yeah, so the Philly mob was a tributary, basically, of the New York. I mean, everybody was, right? The commission was the 5 families, and they were all New York families. So, I mean, New York was definitely in charge. The interesting thing that happened with the Philly mob and this guy, Nicky Scarfo, who was brutal. I mean, in Philly, in the 80s, there were just, I mean, not hundreds, but dozens of mob hits, because this guy was crazy. You know, my mom was a mob attorney, so she knew him a little bit. She was like, this guy's just out of his mind. This guy just wants to kill people. And everyone knew this. And in the early 70s, Bruno said, little Nicky's out of his freaking mind. We got to get him out of town. So they're like, all right, we'll send him. Where are we going to send him? All right, let's send him to this little town in the shore in Jersey. Let him like run the unions there. It's fine. Place was called Atlantic City. 2 years later, New Jersey legalized gambling. Suddenly, little Nicky is sitting on the Las Vegas of the East, and he runs all the unions. He runs all the building. Donald Trump bought his first property in Atlantic City from Salvi Testas, who was the son of a Philly mob boss. I mean, that's how sort of mobbed up all of this was.
Wow.
But you're right. Giuliani took down the 5 families. I mean, he took RICO. Nobody had ever tried a RICO case before, right? Because in a RICO case, it's like, you don't have to exactly have committed the crime. If you were involved in the conspiracy, we can get you. And that was why they could never touch mob bosses, because mob bosses were never involved directly. And Giuliani said, let's give it a shot, did the commission case, and he basically destroyed. I mean, they're still there, but they like smuggle cigarettes now or like sell weed. They're not.
It's not the same. You know what? Because you bring up Giuliani, he's an interesting character. I was actually fortunate to meet him virtually. I was on his radio show, and then he had me on his podcast, which, by the way, is surreal for someone like myself. But he's an interesting character with like an interesting story arc, where like his personal life is a little bit messy. But he was involved in a lot of really impactful things, like one, being the mayor during the 9/11, his involvement when taking down the mob, in many ways cleaning up the city, making it so people feel like that they want to come into the city. So, you know, and then now he's kind of like on a different story arc where he's being involved in a RICO case.
Yeah. No, that's one of the great ironies. I mean,
Yeah.
he was the first person who really gave this thing a shot, and now he's sort of implicated in one. I mean, look, I don't know, man. Things got messy at the end of 2020 and in January of 21. I've never been shy about saying that I think Trump handled it incredibly badly. I don't think Giuliani handled it particularly well. To my way of thinking, I mean, by the time they called it for Biden, which in fairness wasn't, I believe, until Saturday, right? Like it took 4 or 5 days. Yeah. It was clear to me that there was nothing that was gonna. I mean, it was clear to me that it was funny, like because I was writing at the Federalist at the time, and you know, we woke up, we were doing a podcast out of there, and the next morning, like I went to breakfast with a friend of mine, and like I was ignoring my phone, and like when I finally looked at my phone, they were like, you know, you're going to go to Philly with Chris Bedford. You guys are going to look into fraud in Philly. And I was born and raised in Philly, and I was like, you know, this is my job. Like, of course I'm going to do it. But being born and raised in Philly, I was like, of course there's fraud. There's always fraud. You know what I mean, like yes, we're going to find fraud, and it's not going to matter, which is kind of what happened. But
well, that's been my whole thing when it comes to the finding an election fraud. Because I'm thinking to myself, okay, in one breath, I'll hear Republicans, Trump supporters, whoever, say that these blue cities. Okay, so that's an acknowledgement, almost to a fault, saying we could never win these places. Yet, they believe that the election hinged on these very blue cities. It doesn't make any sense when you put it together.
No, I don't think it does. I think that there is... You know, it's interesting. I've been tracking, I don't know if this will ever turn into a column. It's just something that struck me recently, and so I've been keeping a running tab of things that I find similar between Trump and Elon Musk, because I find them to be very, very sort of similar characters. And one of the ones that I realized, you know, they're both very trolly. You know, they both sort of like use that, you know, and then like when somebody calls them out on something offensive, they say, no, what? It's a joke. You don't think, you know, so. But one of the things that I find very similar between the two of them is they both have a tendency to sort of demand that their closest supporters, or the people who they keep closest, say absurd, ridiculous things. Almost in order to sort of like protect their loyalty. So in Trump's case, like you had to say he had the largest inauguration crowd ever, when demonstrably he didn't, right? Or you had to say like, the 2020 election was stolen, right? In Musk's case, you had to pretend that the first Tucker broadcast on X got more viewers than the Super Bowl, which was always just absurd nonsense, right? I mean, just foolishness. And all of these otherwise somewhat serious people are like, or some of them very serious people are like, you know, yeah, this is the biggest, Tucker's got 100 times the views that he ever had on Fox. Mainstream media is dead, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, none of it's true.
Right.
But you have to say it because that's sort of the loyalty test.
Yeah, there is definitely that loyalty test. And on top of that, I don't know about Elon Musk, because honestly, I don't pay too much since he took over. I kind of trailed off paying attention to what he's doing, because it seems to be all over the place. But when it comes to Trump, what's very interesting is that, I think I was telling my wife about this, there's an entire ecosystem built around Trump. Whether you hate him or you love him, when he went out of office, CNN essentially died because they had no one to complain about who was in power. And then you have the people who rely off of him economically or even just socially rely off of him, and they just, whatever he says, they just repeat. And as someone, and that's one of the reasons I like following you, is because like you're critical. Like I feel like you are saying, yeah, I'm on your side, but that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Like that's
I'm not on the side of conservatives in power. I'm on the side of my readers. I mean, that's the only. I'm not on the side of my outlets. I'm not on the side of any politician. I'm not on the side of any billionaire. I have a very sort of deep-bred and natural distrust of people who are in power, and I still look at the job of journalism with the old H.L. Mencken saw of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. So I mean, the only responsibility is always to the readers, and that's why. It's funny. I think that one of a mistake that I made for about the first, and I've been doing this about 10 years now, and the first 5 years, it took me about 5 or 6 years to learn this. First mistake that I made was like, I thought, oh, well, the Federalist is running my columns in the New York Times, the New York Post. Like, I must have very important things to say, right? People must be reading this because my opinion is of great value to everyone. And I realized that's not true. That's not actually what it is. The job specifically of the columnist is to be listening to people, is to be reflecting what you see in society. And I learned that by reading Selena Zito, who I think is the best columnist in the country, quite frankly. And it's important. You always have to be thinking about the readers first.
That's interesting you say that, because there are times that I do and there's times that I don't. Because obviously we're on Twitter. Twitter is just one place. It'd be like if someone said, America is New York City. Like, well, New York City is one place.
Yeah.
Like, there are other places and things are a little bit different. So, that's why the barometer is go outside.
Yeah.
Talk to people, meet people. Twitter is real, like there are actual people that exist there, but it's a reality compared to this reality. You kind of put them together and see, like, are these people just insane? Yeah,
but it's also a very self-selecting part of society, right? I mean, I think I always, it's funny, I was talking to Rob George, a columnist at Bloomberg now, about this just yesterday. We were talking about the difference in X versus Twitter, right? Where what Twitter was under Jack, for better or worse, was the water cooler of the journalistic industry for both sides, really, right? And you would watch talking points sort of take shape as people were having these conversations on the platform. And there were never that many people who used the platform. That wasn't where the influence was. The influence came when everybody who wrote for the New York Times and the Federalist, the National Review, and everybody else were kind of framing, okay, here's the reality that we're working on at this social media water cooler. And then all of that stuff would make its way into the mainstream media. Right. It's not that anymore, right? I mean, it just isn't. I don't know that it ever will be again. I think X can play a good, important role. I just think it's a different one now. I think that what Musk is trying to do is sort of a hostile takeover of small, independent, conservative media, and eventually have all of those people work directly for him, as opposed to being the place where these outlets share their stuff. I think that's why there's no more headlines. That's why, and look, that's a perfectly sort of viable goal, but it serves a very different purpose than it did. Yeah. Yeah. Do you mind if I smoke before I take the show? No, I'm in here while we...
No, you can smoke while we're talking.
Awesome.
I'm fine. I don't know what Musk's goal is when it comes to all this, because if he's in one breath he says, listen, Twitter's losing money. Honestly, I don't even know how Twitter existed. Like, right. I knew someone who worked at Twitter, and they would tell me, like, I don't know how we make money. So obviously Twitter was hemorrhaging money, hence why he got in. He just fired all these people because it didn't make any sense. It was overinflated. So then his focus is we need to start making money. But his focus also seems to be that he wants to have a free speech platform.
Yes, bingo.
Now, the problem is this. I'm all for free speech, but I'm a realist, and I recognize that, sorry, not everybody wants to advertise in between someone saying Jews are this and blacks are that. Like, it's not a good look.
Yeah.
So it's hard to become this big, profitable platform while having absolute free speech.
Well, that was the telling thing about the go fuck yourself moment, right?
Yeah.
Because everybody was like, yeah, you tell him, Elon. But when you watch that entire clip, right, Sorkin says to him, well, wait a minute, if you're not going to listen to the advertisers, like, how are you going to make any money? And that's when he goes, oh, my message to the advertisers, go fuck yourself, right? Never, well, it was interesting because at first the crowd kind of laughs, right? And he says it again and looks at the crowd, and it's not a friendly crowd, right? It's the New York Times book thing or whatever. Like, these are not fans of Elon Musk, right? And he looks at them as if, like, they're about to cheer again, and they don't. They're dead silent. And he says it one more time. And then Sorkin says, well, okay, like, I understand, but wait, you've got Linda Yaccarino right there. She's got to sell advertisements. How does this work? And he starts hemming and hawing, and if you recall, then he says, well, then the advertisers will destroy the platform, and it will be their fault. And we'll make sure that everybody knows it was their fault.
I did not catch that.
And it's like, okay, I mean, I'm not sure that's a big threat to these people, right? Yeah, I mean, I was very hopeful. I wrote a couple columns saying, hey, give Musk a chance. He could really do something good here. And the main thing that I wanted him to address was this question of content moderation. Because content moderation is a huge problem for our society right now. And I think, unfortunately, he didn't take the problem seriously enough. I think he also made a fundamental mistake in that he thought that content management was a technological problem. It's actually a philosophical and ethical problem, and a very, very old one. Right? You can make the argument that Socrates died as a result of content moderation. Right? He says what he says. The Athenians say, take that back or you have to die. And Socrates says, I'm not taking it back. And he drinks the hemlock. Right? So, I've been reading Aquinas recently, and it almost goes back to Plato's theory of forms, where Plato says, well, how do we know what a chair is, right? And it's like, well, it's 4 legs and you sit on it. Well, so does a stool, right? And it's like, so how do you define this thing? And Plato's answer was, there's an ideal form of the thing. Metaphysically, we can't see it. We don't have access to it, but it exists. And everything that is, in fact, a chair is sort of a piece of this ideal form of it. As you get into the Middle Ages, there start to be 2 ways of looking at this. So you have the realists and the nominalists. Now, the realist, it means something different than what we mean today. The realist said, no, Plato's right. You can't see it. It's completely metaphysical. But we see sort of the shadows of it. The nominalists said no. The nominalists said, this is a set of things. We can put parentheses here and list all of the things that constitute a chair. Or maybe we can't do it, but eventually it should be possible to do this. Well, if anything has the capability of doing that, now instead of a chair, we're talking about hate speech, right?
Right.
Because the ideal form of hate speech. Well, a computer ought to be able to compile every possible example.
Yeah.
Right? And then as an algorithm just say, oh, if you do one of these examples, you're off. Well, it can't. Turns out the nominalists were wrong. Computer can't do that. So what are you left with? How are we supposed to make these determinations as to what is okay to say and what's not okay to say?
Then it becomes highly subjective.
It has to be subjective.
Yeah. And then human beings come into play, and then it's depending on which human being sees what, that's the problem.
Yeah.
And my whole thing is this. I'm pro free speech. However, I'm not going to simp for someone who's an obvious white supremacist. Like, sorry, if you get kicked out, then that's what it is. However, if someone says, I like Trump, and then someone bans them because they say, I like Trump, well then, I think that's part of political speech. I think that's within the realm. They shouldn't be banned because they have a certain viewpoint in politics. And the thing that I do like is that seems to be going away.
Yeah.
As far as political speech being banned on either side, the communists are on there too, and they say whatever they want to say. That's fine. You know, there seems to be a clear indicator as far as threats. I'm fine with, you know, things like that.
There was a fundamental transformation in terms of what became. So it was interesting, right? When Trump won, Jamel Bouie wrote a piece. I can't remember if he was at the Times yet. I don't remember where he wrote this, but he wrote a piece about having been in studio, realizing that this was happening, and just needing to take a walk and like all of the implications. And so I thought it was actually a very well written column. And he's obviously very upset about it. And what he was upset about was that he felt that for the first time, at least in decades, somebody had run a political campaign specifically on white grievance that he didn't think was ever going to happen. Mm-hmm. I didn't quite disagree with that, but I was interested in what he was feeling and why he was feeling it, and like, you know, what's happening in this moment. And it struck me that for most of my life, there was a deal in place. I almost kind of call it the Jimmy the Greek deal, right? Like if you said something overtly racist, overtly sexist to a lesser extent, but anti-Semitic, something like that, it was a social and professional death penalty.
Right.
That's it, right? You don't work anymore. The problem is, once the left started making the argument that that unconscious and unintentional racism was the same thing as intentional racism, well, the penalty can't be the same. Right. Right? You can't fire everybody who, you know, culturally appropriates a taco. Like that, you know, like that's not going to work. Like there's not going to be a workforce, right? And we never sort of bridged that gap, right? We still treat racism as this thing that you get the social and professional death penalty for, but we've broadened the list of offenses out so widely that it can't possibly be enforced. Mm.
No, that's a good point. The other side effect of that is if everything is racist, then if everything is racist, then how do we approach anything? Yes. And also, I think lately there's been like the counter effect to all of that. So like the 2020 to beginning of 2022, everything is white supremacy, everybody's terrible, everybody is this. The counter reaction is to say that anything that they support is also negative. And it's like, no, that's not what we want to do. You're just doing woke in the reverse. Yes. You know, that doesn't make any sense. And I think and it's not just myself, I think other people are noticing that there's this creeping authoritarianism that seems to be popping up, especially in the past like 3-4 months. There's been this elevation, especially since Musk took over. Yeah. It seems to be now they're just like full bore white grievance. Yeah. Anytime someone who is black, Hispanic, whatever, any non-white does something wrong, it's because of DEI. Yeah, yeah. You know, it's gone in the complete other direction.
Well, I'll tell you. Maybe this is something to discuss. I'll grab the brajol after this. But my biggest fear, and this is not a fear that I really had 2-3 years ago. My biggest fear about the American conservative movement today is that it will adopt the tactics of the left, because you cannot adopt the tactics of the left without adopting the ideology of the left. It looks like you can, you kind of think you can, you really can't. Because at the end of the day, when you adopt those sort of like censorious, ideas and you're going to cancel people on the other side because we have to fight, right? Don't be a rhino, don't get rolled over. No, man, you're just going to be pulling down the Martin Luther King statue instead of the Christopher Columbus statue. And what the hell is the difference? Right. hold on, let me grab the pretzel. I'll grab that for you.
Thank you so much. That was good.
Yeah. Oh, good. Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate melon's a nice little. All right. Well, first of all, let me serve your.
So let me, while you're doing that, let me ask you, what do you think of the term the woke right?
I got mixed feelings about it. Probably because I have some mixed feelings about just the term woke in general.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, I know what it means. I mean, I don't think it's like, I don't think it doesn't apply or fit. You know, I have no freaking clue what Charlie Kirk thinks he's doing this week with the like Martin Luther King stuff. I mean, it just seems utterly bizarre to me. Like, I really can't get my head around it. Here you go, some pressure.
That's actually something that I was hearing people saying that Charlie Kirk said something in particular about MLK. But
apparently at the TPUSA thing, he said something along the lines of like, he was a bad person and he said one good thing once that he didn't actually believe. And it's like, you know, and he's on the record, as is like everybody in the world, praising King.
Right.
And so it's like, what happened in the last 6 months or whatever? And it is this sort of reactionary, like, no, everything that you were told was good is bad. And, you know, it frustrates me because, you know, I mean, I think I'm you know, I know I'm older than you, but like, in the 20th century, people worked really hard and very intentionally to make this country the most equitable and least racist society on the face of the earth, right? This was very intentional.
Right.
And people just act like it was always this way and like, you know, burn it all down. And it's like, no, you know, we worked at this. We handed it over to you. And
thank you, sir.
Thanks. And it does. It just seems like the people who only know the 21st century do not have respect for what happened in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And what happened in the 20th century was nothing short of miraculous in every conceivable way, from science to civil rights to, I mean, everything, right? Mm. And it's like, no, we suck. And that's the other thing, right? Because there's a point at which conservatives say, you know, I got very mad about the William Penn statue coming down, and, you know, thankfully I don't have to knock on wood, actually, because it's not coming down, right? Mm-hmm. That decision got reversed. But my initial reaction was like, you just kind of hate America. You kind of hate what it stands for. Yeah. And to me, like, I don't know how you can fail to celebrate the advancements in equality, whether it's, you know, racial or gay rights or women's rights. I don't know how you can fail to celebrate that and say that you love the country. You know, like what do you think things were like in 1950? You don't want to go back to that. Like,
yeah. So if I could tell you, you've probably noticed, I don't typically talk about the past. Mm-hmm. Because I think what we end up doing is seeing what we want to see about the past. Either we idolize the past, mm-hmm. or we attack the past because it had a flaw. And I'm thinking to myself, you act like we're perfect now.
Yes.
Like, human beings are flawed, which means every generation of human being is flawed. I was just telling my wife, if I could build, and this is just in my own belief, if I could build a idealistic timeline, it would be the technology of today, mm-hmm. with the sensibility, the irreverence, and the not taking itself so seriously 90s.
Yeah.
That, to me, that would be the perfect era. But I can't go back to the 90s because the internet fucking sucked. You know, it took 10 minutes to open up a folder, and your computer's working really hard to mm-hmm. do that. I don't miss that at all. But like, I think we see certain things, and what makes it even worse for someone like Charlie. How old is Charlie?
13.
No, I mean Charlie Kirk.
Oh, Charlie Kirk.
I was like,
I don't know.
I know Charlie Kirk is young, but now there's he's not
Millennial, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think he's 30 yet. He's on.
I don't know. Say somewhere in that neighborhood.
Somewhere in that range. He's younger than me, right? So, which means he's nowhere close to even understanding what it was like to live in whatever era, whether it's Martin Luther King's era or prior. He has no idea. And the only thing that we can do is try to listen to stories of maybe people who were alive.
Yes.
But that's just a perspective. It would be like to understand what 2020 was like. Let's talk to a BLM activist.
Yeah.
It's like, well, they have their own perspective as to what 2020 was like. So we all have. That's why, like, when people argue over the past, it is so frustrating because at the end of the day, you can't change it.
No. Well, and I think the mistake is to think that there's only one sort of correct version.
Right.
You know? So
right.
I mean, like, I was always opposed to taking down most of the Confederate statues. Like I was, you know, if it went up 10 minutes ago, all right. But like anything that had been there for, I don't know, 50 to 100, I was like, no, like this is part of the place. This is, you don't take. And part of the reason that, maybe the biggest reason that I was against it was that, for better or worse, like, this is the contribution that these people chose to make to posterity, right? I think the most grievous example of this is the statue of Abraham Lincoln that was actually paid for by freed slaves, right? And progressives are like, no, we don't like it. You know, it's like, oh, okay, right? And it's like, people have to be allowed to put a society has to be allowed to like put these markers down as part of their posterity. Now, you don't have to agree with it, right? So like, I'm not a big, I'm no fan of the Confederacy. I'm not a big fan of General Robert E. Lee. Like, I don't even think he was that great of a general at the end of the day.
Right.
But I don't want a statue taken down. I understand that there are people for whom he is a hero for non-nefarious reasons.
Right.
Right? The same way that as an Irish Catholic, I would abhor a statue of Oliver Cromwell. There's plenty of British people who think Oliver Cromwell was great. Okay. I don't want the statue taken down.
I think the only time I will understand having a statue taken down is if the statue is located in this town and the people of that town decide that they don't want it. All right, I got it.
But that never happens.
Never happens.
No, what happens is like some commission or some like woke city council just makes the decision. When they took the Teddy Roosevelt statue down, I helped organize a protest in New York to try to save it. That's a really important statue to a lot of people, and it's gone. We lost that one. But I ran a column at the Post where I said, listen, easy answer here. Let's just have a referendum. If, in fact, there are millions of people in New York City who are offended by the statue of Teddy Roosevelt, let's just put it to a vote. And if, I'd like there to be a supermajority, but whatever, if 55% of New Yorkers say, yeah, that Teddy Roosevelt statue really bothers me, let's get rid of it, then we'll get rid of it. But they never do that because those people don't exist.
Right. No one cares that much.
No.
It's like I had a decent day at work, but that goddamn Teddy Roosevelt.
I had to drive by that Teddy Roosevelt statue again. I hate it.
So this is the go outside, right? Go outside, talk to people. They have bigger problems, and to kind of bring it back to what we were saying before, it's not just about how you feel; it's about what people feel. So that's why I say I'm kind of both, because I go outside, or actually even more so. I've worked a whole bunch of jobs around a whole bunch of people of all types of backgrounds, and just by being in these different environments, you just understand people a little bit. And then I've the added bonus of traveling to different countries. And you start to realize, and actually Cat Williams said it in his, in the viral podcast episode, he said, as much as you travel around, he's like, everybody's just about the same.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. So if everybody's just about the same, they want certain things, and then you just kind of like, you just listen.
Yeah, but the difference is that there's a lot of people who aren't being listened to. I mean, part of the time, you know, when that revelation really dawned on me as a writer, and I'm really grateful that it was pre-2020, because I would not have been able to handle being in New York and writing about the lockdowns the way that I did had I not come to this realization that it really wasn't about me. And when that really became solidified for me I think it was 2019. I was still every once in a while I was still doing jobs for my buddy's moving company. And he had a truck that had to go from New York to Arkansas and back. This might have been 2018, actually. The next year he had one that had to go to LA, and I did that one too. But so the first trip was to Arkansas and back. And funnily enough, actually, my first stop was West Virginia, which was maybe the first time I'd ever been in West Virginia. But on the other side. Okay. It was Wheeling. But I remember getting in the truck, and I'm driving across the Verrazano, leaving, not leaving New York, but, leaving Brooklyn. I remember thinking to myself, because what I was going to do was, I had my buddy was like, drive 6-7 hours a day, it's fine. And so I was going to interview people and write articles and do that stuff. And I thought to myself, like, you're crazy. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to like walk into a bar or a restaurant and just like start asking random people about like politics? Like, why would anybody want to talk to like some journalist from New York? Like, you're crazy. Mm-hmm. Like, this is dumb. And I'm thinking this like the whole way across Pennsylvania, and I find, I take the left and I'm in Wheeling, West Virginia. And, I picked a spot like down the street. There's this sort of like sports bar or something. There's sports bar, pub, restaurant. And I go and I just sit at the bar, have some food, order a drink. Next thing you know, I'm talking about the election with somebody. And when, in fact, they found out that I was writing for the New York Post for this one, they found out that I was writing for the New York Post, I couldn't shut them up. Because they know that they're not being listened to. Yeah. And the fact that there was finally somebody there who not only might listen, but like might put it in one of these things was like, and it clicked. It was like, this is why Trump appeals to people. And people were explaining it to me. Mm-hmm. That they feel like he listens. And I think he does, right? Because what does a salesman do? A salesman listens. Right. So does a con man. So whichever way you want to look at him, I tend to look at him more as a salesman. Lots of people look at him as a con man. Mm-hmm. But in either case, you got to know your mark. You got to listen to your mark. You got to be watching them and paying attention to them. Yeah.
That's the thing. That's the thing that I noticed. And honestly, that's why I even started doing all this stuff, because I felt like my voice wasn't being represented, right?
It wasn't.
Because it wasn't. And to be honest with you, even from people that I generally agree with during that time, they weren't saying it the way I wanted it to be said. Yeah. So that's why I even started writing my book, is because most of the mainstream media outlets were filled with these ideological elitists who will look at a person in the face in the middle of West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and as they're telling them, this is why, they're saying, that's not really why. Yeah.
Right. No, you're exactly right. No, it's not it. It's really because you're uneducated, or it's really because you're a racist, or it's really because right. It's exactly right.
And they just talk about them and they talk over them. And they're not actually listening to what these people say. And that's where I started feeling like they're not listening to what someone like myself thinks. Yeah. Because there are lots of people who are like me. And I don't feel like many of my opinions on race isn't a conservative opinion. Right. This is actually pretty commonplace for a lot of people who are black and not black. Yes. And I'm just like, why aren't we being represented? Why aren't we being heard? And that's honestly like why I even started. Yeah. Is because no one was actually listening to what we had to say. No one was speaking for us. And so I think that's
the right reason to do it, yeah. Right? I mean, I think it was, Kevin Williamson, who, is an excellent columnist. I don't agree with him very much these days, but, he always said, like, why are you the one writing this? Yeah. Right? And that's what you're really looking for. Like, not that there's stuff that like only you can, but well, I mean, honestly, everything you write is something only you can write, right? Mm-hmm. But I mean, on a given subject matter, like, why are you the right person? You know, what is your breadth of knowledge that you bring to this that can help to explain why people are responding and reacting the way that they are? You know, like. You know, why? Like what is, you know, Nikki Haley has, you know, 15% to 15% as we talk, right? Like, everybody's like, well, I've never met a Nikki Haley supporter. So why, right? Are the polls wrong? Or is it possible that these people are less likely to be wearing a Nikki Haley hat than a Trump supporter or DeSantis supporter is to be wearing that, right? I mean, it's a little different. Right. And yeah, you only get that. I pay attention to the polls as a sort of like 3,000, 30,000 feet thing, right? Like, if over a long period of time the polls sort of telling you the same thing, that, you know, something's there. But you can't only rely on that. You have to go out in the world and you got to talk to people who aren't otherwise talking about it. And there's a real skill in that too, because people the data guys will come at you and be like, well, so what? You talked to a dozen people between New York and Arkansas. Like, that's not a mathematical sample. Like, what does that prove? Mm-hmm. And, I've spoken to Selena about this because she does something very similar. And it's like, you have to know who to talk to. Like, it's a skill. You learn, like, who is going to be indicative of this community, who is going to be somebody who reflects the opinions of a lot of people. And you can sort of figure that out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you can. I like to think that the people who aren't stuck in politics 24/7 are some of the best people to listen to as to what is about to happen. So, like, I was talking to a guy who, I won't give too many details, but I was talking to a guy, and full-time job, he's in management, his kids, married, and he's like, I'm trying to follow politics a little bit. I only have a little bit of time to kind of understand what's going on. I was like, this guy is the perfect guy you want to talk to. Yeah. And what's the first thing he says to me? He says, I've never hated a president until Biden. That was the very first thing that he admitted to me. And this is the first time we've ever talked about politics. Yeah. It's always weird when you meet someone, you're like, can I talk to, and we just kind of slowly trickled into it. Then he said that. I was like, all right, we're cool. We can talk. Yeah, yeah. But that's the type of person, especially with a statement like that. Usually it's like, I've been voting Democrat or Republican.
But it doesn't have to be. Like, I know what you mean about, like, the little dance of, like, like, what do you think about the border, right? Yeah. Sort of like figuring out, like, where somebody is. But honestly, I found the experience of meeting Democrats in that kind of situation, that in that one-on-one or small group dynamic, it's a very different thing. So, like, when we were in Philly for Moms for Liberty, I was covering that, but I was also covering, like, some other stuff for Fox. And I was, just again doing this thing where I would go out and sort of talk to people. And there was one night, there's a little tapas place that I went to. And again, I'm sitting at the bar and getting the tapas. And there were these two women. And I got to talking to them, and they were like, what do you do? I said, I write for Fox News and the Daily Mail. And, like, they'd never met anybody who, like, watches Fox News, let alone writes for Fox News, right? And they were kind of fascinated by it. And we had a long conversation about Biden and the Democrats and the Republicans and, like, what's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And there was no acrimony whatsoever. Right. I think because of the environment and because of the tone, and that used to be normal. I mean, when I was, the first thing I ever wrote, column I ever got paid for was in Narratively. I don't know, say this is like 2012, something like that. And it was about being a conservative in the New York theater scene. Which was I was the only one. I mean, literally, literally the only one. There were some libertarians, but, like, no, Republican conservatives, like, there weren't any. Mm. And I was the host of our 10-minute play series. And starting in about 2009 or so, I started bringing my conservative politics into the hosting, because I'm hosting the show at the Bowery Poetry Club, where everybody, I mean, forget Democrat. I mean, these people are like as leftist as you can get. Mm-hmm. And I cracked these jokes, you know, like about Obama or like whatever it was, or, you know, and we had fun with it.
Right.
And they'd boo me and heckle me, and I'd go back and forth with them. But, you know, we always had a lot of fun with it. And that stopped after Trump.
Yeah.
It wasn't fun anymore. You know, and I'm not blaming Trump for that. I don't know whose fault it is or what exactly happened. There were undercurrents of it. I mean, the earliest that I remember people saying, you know, if you support so-and-so, then I don't think I can even talk to you about this. You know what it was? It was actually Hillary versus Obama. Because people forget how heated that got. Like, people forget that election where I had friends who supported Obama and I had friends who supported Hillary, and it was like, do not get them started talking about this. That was the earliest iteration, but it was nowhere near as fierce as what you would find eventually with Trump.
Yeah.
To the point where people just won't talk to each other anymore. That's
always been, see, that's the part where everybody just starts taking themselves too seriously. Where I wasn't in the political sphere like I am today, but I was following politics. I was interested in stuff like that. And I was a Democrat, but I didn't have vitriol towards Republicans. Honestly, admittingly, I didn't know much about Republicans because of my source of media. You know, you're getting through a left-wing filter, rather than going directly to what are Republicans saying out of their mouth. What are they saying? So I never had like vitriol towards them. But the vitriol, exactly what you said, once Trump happened, it was a different level of vitriol. Like, I had this neighbor, she wore a necklace, and my wife knows, she wore a necklace that said, "Fuck Trump." Mm-hmm. All the time, everywhere.
Yeah, but all kinds of, Trump's lawyer wears a necklace that says FJB.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, you know, like, that's where we are. I mean, yes, exactly. No, that's exactly right. And I grew up in Philly, right? And Philly's very different than New York in a sense. You know, in New York, like, people like jaw at each other it doesn't happen in Philly. Yeah. In Philly, you jaw at somebody, there's going to be a fight in the first 2 seconds. Right. I've described Philadelphia as a city that is covered in sawdust and everybody's smoking. So be careful where you ash, right? In New York, you know, you just, fuck you, blah, blah, blah. You know, do that for 10 minutes and like nothing happens. And that's sort of like, I still have that Philly attitude of like, at the point at which you're saying like, fuck you to me, that's not part of any kind of like normal discourse that I'm going to like
tolerate. Yeah.
Yeah. Or get engaged in, you know, but now that's just sort of like par for the course. And it is that kind of, you know, it is a lot of that sort of like online bravado of like people. But, you know, it's funny because we used to say, and I think it was certainly accurate, that like people will treat people in a certain way online that they never would in real life, right? Like, you would never like, you know, meet a stranger and like say the horrible things that people tweet, right? That was the assumption. And I believed that was true. I'm not sure that it is true anymore. I actually think that social media could be training us to be more like we are on social media in real life. You remember the election day video from Virginia of the guy who's just like going after the poll worker for being a Republican? Did you see this video? And he's just like, you're the one destroying the country and you're blah, 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 blah. And just like, there's this anger on his face, that like there's this fire in his eyes and his face, like he's like out of his mind, and self-righteousness. And when I watched that, and I was writing a column about it for Fox, and I watched it, and I was like, there's something about this. And I rewound it, and I watched it again, and I was like, there's something here, and I'm not seeing it. And I watched it again, and I watched it again, and it finally clicked. This is a Twitter tirade. Right. This guy is performing Twitter in the plastic of reality.
Yeah.
And I think we see more and more and more of that, right? And it's not the only way that the internet does that. I mean, you see like, you read these things about like sort of the impact of porn on sexual expectations of sort of young people and things like that, that it's not, there is no line between your life on social media or the internet and your life in real life. If you're acting this way over here, it's going to make its way over here.
Yeah. No, you're right. It actually, it reminds me, like, when it comes to how people think and feel and stuff like that, a lot of it is not what they say, but it's like their body, how they look, their facial expressions and stuff like that. There's this video, I don't know if you remember, is a guy who I think it said beer, barbecue, and something. I can't remember. But they were doing a press conference. This is during when Giuliani's going around trying to say that there's election interference. Yeah. And there was some press conference that was happening. And some officials were talking, they were wearing, the mask and everything. And this guy, because you could tell it wasn't like a high security or anything like that. They're next to this entrance door. And this guy, he just kind of comes out and he starts yelling, "The Biden crime family's still in the election. The media's covering up." And he's freaking out. But when he's done, he's like, he doesn't know. Like he's like, "Oh my God, I did the Twitter thing." And like,
now what?
Like,
now
what?
Close the app. I don't know. Like what? Like go to Instagram. Smile. What are you supposed to do?
And then he just left.
That reminds me. Back in 2011, I was pretty fascinated by Occupy Wall Street. I was already a conservative, so like I didn't like anything that they had to say, obviously, but I was sort of fascinated by and it was fascinating. And actually. I think was the starting point of a lot of what we see, right? There's no Chaz without Occupy Wall Street. There's probably no George Floyd riots without Occupy Wall Street, in any event.
Yeah.
But I remember I took my little brother down one time and, with me during the like month or 2 months that it was there. And they would occasionally do marches and stuff. And Andy Reid was the coach of the Eagles, but was unpopular at that time because they kept like losing NFC championship games and stuff like that. My brother was furious. So all these people are like chanting for like workers' rights and like all this stuff. And my brother's just like in the middle of it, it's big sunglasses on with a sign, like chanting, "Fire Andy Reid! Fire the fat man!" And like everyone's just looking at him like completely confused, like, what are you talking about? It was like this perfect moment for me of like, my brother's actually like saying something that people probably care a whole lot more about than whatever this sort of like specific demand that's going on is. But Occupy Wall Street was weird, man. It was like, because there were totally two halves of Zuccotti Park. So over here, you had the sort of college educated, this is where the library was. This is where the General Assembly was, right? One thing people forget about Occupy Wall Street's General Assembly operated off of a progressive stack. Nobody knew what this was, right? What a progressive stack is, you can go sign up to speak. Speaking order was literally in order of your level of oppression. So if you were a trans, lesbian, black person, you were going to speak first, You might have a spot like in the middle, right? Like for me, like I forget about it, 4 o'clock in the morning, right? And the idea is that they're trying to sort of invert the traditional thing and all of this. But I remember for me, that was the first time that the left became that explicit, right? About how they intended this to go, about what this meant, right? It wasn't this organic, we all love each other, and as a result of that, everything's going to be all right. It's like, no, we are ordering this, we are structuring this. There are punitive measures, there are rewards, there are, and it's creepy.
It's very creepy. And what worries me, I think what worries a lot of people is how this is reflecting in like real world stuff, like your job and things of that nature. And I think actually like the whole DEI thing is really insidious because it's framed as being a good thing to right the wrongs of the past and so on and so forth. But what it ends up doing is kind of poisoning the well, because either it is overtly not selecting some, overtly discriminating against some, and uplifting others, which obviously pisses off someone who's being discriminated against, or presumes they're being discriminated against. And that's the other thing. The other thing is you don't know.
Yeah. DEI also presumes that the second half of the 20th century was a failure when it was, in fact, demonstrably a spectacular success.
Right.
Right. And it's like, they just pretend. I mean, think about, I've written about this before, but think about the fact that in 1956, you know, you had widespread segregation, everything, you know, the whole deal. 30 years later, in 1986, the Huxtables were the prototypical American family. That was 30 years. That's all that took. And sitcoms played a big role, and comedians played a big role, and like all of these things played a role. I don't think a transformation like that has ever happened that quickly. Right? And an interesting thing, so that's 86. And where did the Cosby Show take place? Cosby Show takes place Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, like that sort of like brownstone-y part of Brooklyn, right? And it's the Huxtables, and she's a lawyer and he's a doctor, and they have all these, you know, diverse Brooklyn friends, and everybody gets along, and it's great.
Right.
3 years later, in basically that same Brooklyn neighborhood, Spike Lee would set Do the Right Thing. And now, and I love Do the Right Thing, it's a brilliant movie. But now, all of a sudden, this idyllic Cosby Show neighborhood of like, you know, post-racism and everybody's fine is actually a smoldering cauldron of racial animosity where like, you know, black people want to burn down a pizza shop because like Sammy Davis Jr. isn't on the wall, right? I mean, and you know, and there's that famous scene of like just every different group like calling another group like a slur, right? That like close-up shot. And it fascinates me because those are only 3 years apart. So what is the difference between, and Spike Lee and Bill Cosby are what, one generation apart?
Yeah.
Roughly?
Yeah.
Right? Like Spike Lee could have been Bill Cosby's kid, right? So you've got one generation apart looking at this same place, at the same phenomenon, which, I mean, could not be a different interpretation of where things stood there.
Yeah.
It's kind of amazing to me.
It is very amazing. I think part of that is ideology, because if I can't really think of like a specific term other than this, but I think Spike Lee comes from the stereotypical pro-black stance.
Yes.
And the pro-black stance is interesting because it is very much so in line with leftist ideology of oppression.
Yeah.
Right? If the pro-black says, we don't have this, it's because they took it.
Right.
Right? So the absence of something is because someone took it from you. So it's always the victim narrative, no matter what it is. And if that pizza shop is doing well, it's because it's taking money from our community.
Yes.
Because there could be a black pizza shop owner that's there, and their existence is taking from us. It is always from a stance that someone is doing something against us to hurt us.
It's fascinating.
And what's interesting to me is someone like Spike Lee, who we could presume he's been wealthy for a long time, still believes that to this day. And in absence of his success, in absence of all these other people's success, and it's not to say, and because someone who's disingenuous would be like, you're trying to say that racism no longer exists. No. Hatred. Racism is hatred.
Yeah.
Right? It's a logical hatred. That will always exist to the end of time because humans are flawed.
Yes.
So what it's about is progress.
Yeah.
Because that's the only thing we can really hope for. There will never be the eradication of hate. But there's something about the preservation of oppression, the preservation of victim ideology. And that's why, like, it's so interesting. Like, I'll show conservatives something that a pro-black says.
Yeah.
And they take it as being the woke leftist ideologue. And I'm like, no, there are two different people, but they come to the same point and make the same
and Cosby was coming out of a completely different tradition in which the attitude was much more along the lines of like, you can try to oppress me. right? But it's not going to work, right? And I mean, that's why he was, he just always had like a college sweatshirt on. He was like, you don't have to be, stuck by this.
Yeah.
I mean, that was just from Fat Albert to the Cosby. I mean, everything that he did was sort of in that vein. It's interesting that there's a cemetery right there. Mm-hmm. That is Harper's Ferry's Black Cemetery, and then on the other side you have the white cemetery. But one of the wonderful things about this area is like everybody knows the history. Everybody I talk to is just like absorbed in the history of where they live, which is wonderful. But there's a preservation effort that a couple people that I know have undertaken for this cemetery, and a lot of the people there were the people who started Storer College, which is one of the first black colleges. It was sort of down the road, right after the Civil War. And I talked to Eli Steele recently because I'd really like to do some kind of a documentary on the effort to restore this place, because I think it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, there were people who were born into slavery who were there, and there were people who were buried there 2 years ago, right? And I think that the story that we have the hardest time telling in United States history is that story of the first 1 or 2 generations of black people coming out of slavery. Because on the one hand, this is the whole thing DeSantis got stuck in, right? Like, are you allowed to say that somebody learned a skill while they were a slave? And this became, and I think that was inartfully worded, but it becomes tricky because then when you say, there was one guy who was like, I believe he was born into slavery or his parents were, and he founded, just down this road, there's the Hilltop Hotel, which by the late 1870s was like one of the fanciest, best known hotels in the country. Right. But this guy's story is an uncomfortable story for the left, I think more so than the right, but for our current understanding, because that's not supposed to happen. Right. Right? He wasn't supposed to be able to, and Thomas Sowell talks a lot about this, like when you look at like literacy rates among blacks by the 1880s, they skyrocketed. Right? Because it was like, okay, now you're allowed to do this, and they did it like every other immigrant group. Right. But that doesn't fit anybody's preferred narrative, and so we just don't tell their stories. I mean, we just don't tell their stories. It's amazing.
It's that gap.
Yeah.
It is a very noticeable gap that no one talks about. It is this idea that slavery happened, and then Martin Luther King.
Or W.E.B. Du Bois maybe, right? The Harlem Renaissance, right? So the 1920s, we pick up the story again, and it's like, wait a minute. Right. That's 60 years, but that's 55 years between 1865 and 1920.
Or and here's another thing I noticed. Well, they'll mistakenly reference something during that gap, and they don't make the connection. So they'll be like, Black Wall Street, they burned it down. Yeah. And I was like, but do you know what that means? Yes. Right. That there was 6 acts.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point.
It's stuff like that. They want, there's a segment of people that want that victimhood. They want to believe that someone is oppressing them. And I think, and I was having this detailed conversation about this mindset, whether it's pro-black, but especially pro-black, they are highly insecure about being black. Yeah. Because like someone who's smart, do they tell you 10 times a day that they're smart? No. No, they just are. Yeah. Right? So you don't need to tell someone that you're black, and as a black man,
isn't the extension of your theory also, though, so if there is this power in victimhood, right, then in order for this to work, since it's operating with 2 sides, doesn't there have to be some attraction to the concept of being the victimizer, right? If you're one of these women who like pays Sarah Rao to like, come have dinner with you and tell you like how awful you are and like, or if you are one of these, and let's face it, the most progressive cohort in the United States are college-educated white progressives, right? So what is it that what is the appeal of dressing yourself in the garb of the victimizer?
Well, savior. That's actually the better framing. They see themselves as the savior. Yeah. Because from their perspective, black people aren't allowed to speak up for themselves. So
Right.
I'm going to, since I've been given this privilege as a white woman, so I'm going to speak
Right.
on behalf of them because they haven't been given a chance.
Yes, I'll use my agency. I'll selflessly use my agency to help people who don't have it. Yeah, I mean, but it's funny because they'll never say that, right? They'll always say, like, you know, of course I'm racist. I'll always be racist. The work never ends. You know, the work, right? Like, that's the question I always want. I was on with Larry Elder yesterday on Eric Bolling's show, and we were talking about all this stuff. And, like, you know, I wrote a Fox column where I framed it by asking DEI departments the classic question from Office Space when the Bobs are trying to figure out who they're trying to fire. And it's like, what would you say you do here? Right? like what is it? Like, what is the measurable, you know, 5 years from now, if I do everything that you say, like, what does my company get out of it? And there's no answer, right? And it's like, how long, and even if, like, how long does it take? Do we have to do this for 5 years? Do we have to do this for 20 years? And the answer seems to be like, no, you have to do it for the rest of your life.
Right.
And you're still going to be horrible. And, you know, which in a sense is kind of Catholic, right? Like, as a Catholic, like, I recognize that in terms of how we think about sin. And we think about, like, of course we're never going to be without sin.
Well, that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
This entire thing is a religious movement. Everything about it is very religious. Like, when they say white supremacy, what they mean is sin.
Yeah.
Right? They're saying that by doing this is sinful. It's white supremacy.
So, now, see, that's McWhorter makes this argument about sort of wokeness being a religion. And I there's one issue that I take with McWhorter on this point, which is that, to my way of thinking, what separates a religion from a philosophy, right, is that a religion requires that you have a duty to something that exists beyond yourself metaphysically, right, to a metaphysical entity, not an idea, an entity. And I don't think wokeness has that. I think wokeness has duty to ideas, but I don't think that there is an entity of deity for wokeness. And that's why I'm not comfortable. It certainly uses the trappings of religion. It certainly looks like a religion. It smells like a religion. It you know, all of those things. It's certainly grafting those things onto itself. But that's what I think it's ultimately lacking, to call it a religion.
So maybe it hasn't progressed that far yet.
Maybe.
Maybe we're in the point of Jesus Christ is still walking amongst man.
Yeah. For them.
Right.
Yeah, maybe it's ChatGPT, right? I mean, ChatGPT, I'm not kidding. I mean, you know, no, I mean, ChatGPT can be trained to only, and is being trained to only say the right things that it's supposed to say, that are the good things and the non-hateful things. And maybe that becomes but I mean, you know, we already have that in the Bible, right? I mean, that's the Tower of Babel, right? And, you know, you get too close to the sky there and, you know, a flood comes. Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. But we're getting close to the end. And so I like to ask everybody, are you optimistic about the future?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I was optimistic about the future before I had a son, and I'm 1,000 times more optimistic about the future now that I do. I mean, I just think that, you know, I just look at what I'll be 50 next year, and, you know, I just look at, like, how far our country has come in my lifetime, certainly in my dad's lifetime, my grandparents' lifetime. You know, we've got a lot of first world problems.
Yeah.
And that kind of, like, is what it is. But ultimately, I think that the American people are a lot closer in mindset than most people do. And I think that the people who are farthest away from each other often get the biggest spotlight and make the most noise. But no, I mean, you know, moving here, for example, like, I had no idea what to expect. And what I found was just such sort of warm and welcoming. I'll tell you a funny story about, like, when I first got here. So I'd been here about 2 weeks from living in Brooklyn, and I was walking over to 7-Eleven, I'm walking down, it's just residential. You drove down a little residential street or whatever. And there's this big, dark pickup truck, like slowing down behind me. I kind of like glance over and it's slowing down more. And, you know, the Brooklyn in me, sort of the Philly in me is sort of coming up like, all right, the hell is this? Like, it's fine. Like, I'm getting myself ready to, like, for whatever the hell this is going to be, right? Mm-hmm. Sure enough, this truck, like, pulls up, boom, right next to me, you know? And I turn around, like, you know, ready, you know? And I look in, and it's this guy and his wife, and he's handing me a piece of paper, and he says, you know, hey, I'm Jimmy. We're starting a church, like, 2 towns down. Can I give you a flyer? And I felt so disgustingly dirty. I felt like the worst person on earth, right? Because I had come up in this way of like, you know, things slows down next to you, you're a little nervous about it.
Right.
And it was the exact guy. It was like, this guy's asking me if I want to go to church, right? He's not trying to rob me or do anything nefarious. So, no, I'm always optimistic. I love people. I think they're fascinating. I think they always tend towards goodness. Not always, I guess, but usually. So no, I'm always optimistic.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm painfully optimistic. I've said this before. The fact that we're sitting down here and talking about it, especially was not that long ago when they were just trying to go after anybody and everybody who had a counter viewpoint. We made it through that. We're here discussing these things. We're being critical. People like myself and others are being platformed and given an opportunity to represent the people that aren't given an opportunity to even be heard. So I'm very much so optimistic about the future. Do I think 2024 is going to be insane? Absolutely.
It will. But here's the trick. You know, here's the one thing that I've learned that saves me a lot of hassle. You know, there's a lot of people who go around calling other people grifters, right? There's a lot of people who go around calling me a grifter, right? And like, oh, you're sure, you know it, right? It's like, that's, oh, you write for the New York Post, Murdoch is telling, you know, as if you sit down to write a column and you're like, your cell phone goes off and it's Rupert Murdoch with an Australian accent being like, Adam, here's what I think you should, you know. Yeah. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? But I very specifically don't do that. I think it's incredibly important that we deal with the people who we deal with on the other side in good faith, right? Whether it's other people on the right, whether it's people on the left, right? And people say, well, a lot of them aren't acting in good faith. Well, it doesn't matter. Whether they are or they're not, you're always better off taking the position that they are. Because first of all, you can't prove that they're a grifter. And second of all, if they really are a grifter, just don't talk to them. There's no point, right? I mean, why are you even engaging with them at all? If you really feel like they're not, you know, they're only doing this because they're being paid to do this and cause trouble, then just disengage from them.
See, actually, that's a very good point you're making. I always assume that these people actually believe what they're saying.
Yes.
I always assume that.
And the thing is, I know so many of, like, within the context of the right, like, you know, I'm very careful. I don't attack people on the right for the most part. No, not for the most part. I'll attack ideas on the right, but I don't attack people.
Right.
I don't, because I think it's counterproductive. There's a great Morrissey line, you know, there's more than enough to fight and oppose. Why waste good times fighting the people you like? Right. So I have friendships in this part of the right, and I have friendships in this part of the right, and you do too, right? There's certain people that I know who sort of cultivate that. And so when this group starts telling me about my buddy over here, and like what a fraud they are, and they don't really believe that. I'm like, no, I'm telling you, I know this person. This is what this person believes. And when this person over here is like, no, they're just blah, blah, I'm like, no, that's not right. It's not
they're
true.
They're saying it because they're getting paid. I'm like,
yeah, no.
Aren't you getting paid?
Yes, you know, like we can all get, if you're a good writer, you can get paid to say anything, right? Like, if you could, like, it's not that hard, right? You end up where you end up because your sensibilities align with that place. Right. Right? It's no more nefarious than that. Like, nobody's writing for National Review because, like, National Review's giving them $1 million, right? They're writing for National Review because their ideology kind of falls in line with National Review or with Human Events or with whatever. And, you know, I think something that you and I are both able to do that's relatively rare. I mean, there's not a lot of people who can run a column at the New York Post or Fox News and Daily Mail and also places like Human Events or even sort of Spectator or stuff like that. And being able to maintain that range is deeply important to me because I want to be writing for everybody on the conservative movement.
Yeah. No,
and I think you do too.
My main objective was to get a byline everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere I possibly can. I just want to get a byline.
Yeah.
And
That's
I'm
exactly what I did.
Some.
Well, let me know if I can help. I might be able, I might know somebody. But once I left the Federalist, once I was no longer on staff at the Federalist, and on staff at the Federalist was kind of like a dream situation that doesn't exist, where I was just left completely alone in New York. I mean, literally, like for 2 years, just like Dave, write whatever you want, and then COVID hit, and when I left the Federalist, except for my brief little ill-advised time on the straight news side at the Post, that was what I wanted. I want to write everywhere I possibly can.
Yeah. I think that I completely agree with you. I think that's incredibly important to do that because not everybody cross-pollinates information.
Yes.
And you need to be able to, like, for example, when I want to criticize the right, I write for the Epoch Times.
Yes.
The reason being, I asked them, can I criticize the right?
Yeah,
They said yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. So that's where I take my stuff when I want to criticize the right. I understand the ecosystem that I'm in.
Yep.
So I know that they want this type of stuff.
Yes.
So if I agree with it, then I'll write.
Yes.
I'll send it to them.
But the flip side of that is if they want some criticism of the right and they call you up or they call me up and we don't agree with their criticism, then we say no.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I've had, Kelly Jane or other like editors call me up and be like, can you write about this? I'm like, no, it's not my position.
Yeah.
And there's no animosity about it. It's just like, it's not your position. You can't write it.
And see, they can't fathom that.
No,
we're grifters.
Right? Yeah, because we're grifters, right? Oh, you're gonna give me like $400. Well, I'll write whatever you want. You know? Like, no, that's not what happens.
Like I have a policy. I've only written one article about reparations, and that's because it was in response to Gavin Newsom basically setting up the commission and ultimately saying, well, we're going to do reparations in a different way. It's like, no. You knew what this was going to turn into. They want money.
Yeah.
And my point was that you guys want reparations. They're never going to give it to you. So it wasn't my opinion on reparations.
Yeah.
I
feel that way about Ukraine. Because I don't know what the hell's going on. I don't trust anything that's coming out of there. And I'm just like, I want no part of this.
But I've had editors ask me to write about reparations, and I say no.
And that's fine, and nobody gets upset. It's like, okay, you're not going to do that.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. I think the term grifter is thrown, just like rhino.
Yeah.
Is thrown at everybody that they just don't like for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But the food was great.
Oh, great.
I really do appreciate like having like a longer conversation. We met briefly.
That was great. I'm so glad we were able to do this.
Yeah.
Let me just check one thing.
But
yeah, this is very cool.
What you got going on there?
What's that?
Are we wrapping up?
Oh, I thought we were wrapped.
No.
I was supposed to wait for clear. See, my old acting instinct should have kicked in. Because I always, whenever I'm doing hits, like I always wait for clear.
Yeah.
You know?
No, but thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And we'll keep in touch. Obviously.
Oh, that's great. See, I'm not comfortable with gratitude. So no, it's wonderful. I'm so glad we were able to do it.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Thank you.